All right. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. We have a real privilege of having Dr. Marten Brienen here, who's going to talk to us about Bolivia. He's going to share with us about drugs, crime, and politics in Bolivia. Dr. Brienen is an associate professor at Oklahoma State University. He's taught both at African and Latin American studies in the University of Miami for many years, from 2004 to 2013. He was also the director of the Latin American Studies program at the University of Miami. He's written extensively on Bolivia, on drug policy, on development related issues. Dr. Brienen originally hails from the Netherlands, did his PhD at the University of Amsterdam. I lose count, but I think the last time I checked, he speaks 9 languages. And Dr. Brienen is many things, but he is 11, my goodness. But he is not boring, right? So we're really in for a treat. He's lived extensively in Bolivia, taught in Bolivia, done a lot of really fascinating work on kind of what he would say is weak states, state fragility, and how this contributes to security-related issues. Lastly, he's a sought-after lecturer throughout the Americas. He's been a visiting professor in Mexico. He's given a lot of lectures to the military and other agencies about these topics. So thank you so much, Dr. Brienen, for joining us today.
My pleasure.
So, out of all things that young Marten Brienen could have gotten into, how did you get interested in this area of study?
God. That's a pretty good question. My dad in the 1980s got fascinated by Latin America and took his sons to Latin America separately. So my older brother went first, and then he took me in 1990. What is it, 1990-ish? So right before I finished high school. So we went to Paraguay and Chile and Bolivia as well. And Bolivia's different. And if you haven't been, then you wouldn't necessarily get that. Bolivia has a lot in common with places like Peru, but it is different. For Latin America, it's just different. You get to La Paz. La Paz is this Aymara metropolis. Like it is, I mean, it's different, and I thought it was fascinating. And the other thing was, after high school, I had to decide what I was going to study, because in the Netherlands you have to pick a topic. Like we don't do this undecided thing. So you have to pick a thing that you're going to study, and I could not decide between whether I was going to pursue my love of languages or my interest in history. And they had this one department where you could do both. And that was Latin American studies. So I sort of stumbled into that, and then wrote a master's thesis on Bolivia, which brought me back there for a year to do research in 1995, 1996. Wrote my thesis in 1996 on Bolivia. So it's kind of that. And my reasoning for picking Bolivia wasn't just that I'd been there and I thought it was interesting, but also that very, very few people study it. Like, I can be the umpteenth person to write something in Argentina or Brazil or Mexico, or I can be like the second person to do something, or the first person to do something in Bolivia. So that's what I did, and I picked a topic then that very few people had written about, which was sort of the military socialist regime of the late 1930s. I picked that, got to go for a year to do research in Bolivia in the archives, where I made a ton of copies of stuff that I could still work on. But kind of that. I picked it because nobody else does Bolivia, and because it's an interesting place.
And you wrote your dissertation on education in Bolivia,
That
actually.
is correct. Yeah, I did.
Yeah, it's really, really fascinating. And you moved into talking over your career, right? To talking about a lot of issues related to Bolivia, from energy security to drugs. One thing you've written extensively about is kind of coca and cocaine in the Andean region. Can you, for our audience, historically kind of talk about what Bolivia's role has been in the drug trade?
Um, well, Bolivia is interesting in the sense that coca is this, just like in Peru, coca is this product, or is this crop that's been around for at least 5,000 years. Indigenous people chew it together with a source of lime that extracts sort of the alkaline, and it doesn't make you high, but it gives you a little bit of a boost, a little bit of energy, and it's apparently good for your oxygen intake, which is super helpful when you live at 50 million feet. Um, so that's been around for a very, very long time. And so coca is a perfectly legal product in Bolivia, has been. The Spanish tried to suppress it for a while, but decided in the end that it was much easier to just tax the chewing of coca and make a bunch of money that way. So it's always been legal. It's always been a legal thing, and it's just something that you encounter in daily life anywhere you are in Bolivia. You have all these street vendors that sell, like you do in all of Latin America, that sell cigarettes and candies and all that other stuff, and they all also sell bags of coca. So it's everywhere. It doesn't matter where you go. This stuff is everywhere. Cocaine, of course, is a much newer product. Cocaine was isolated. What is it, 1860-ish, thereabouts? Um, I can't remember if it's 1860 or 1868, but thereabouts. That's the isolation of cocaine. And then a little bit later, they figure out that you can use it as a topical anesthetic. And then a little bit later, they figure out that if you add it to drinks, it can give you a little boost, like Coca-Cola, that kind of stuff. Um, but so for Bolivia, that's been around for a long time. The coca, at least. The way cocaine ended up in Bolivia is because the United States in the 1950s put this pressure on Peru, which was the original place where most cocaine was manufactured, most illicit cocaine was manufactured um, after World War II. Because, I mean, the place where originally most of that was manufactured in the Upper Huallaga Valley. The United States put some pressure on the Peruvians to please make it stop. They succeeded in doing that, and what they effectively did is they packed up shop and moved to Bolivia next door because Bolivia had a ready supply of coca. Bolivia at the time had just gone through a major revolution, the 1952 National Revolution of Bolivia, um, in which there was big land reforms and the expropriation of a number of major mining concerns and nationalization of tin mines, including ones with headquarters in the United States. So the relationship between the United States and Bolivia was not such that the United States could come to Bolivia and say, "Hey, do something about this cocaine," because they would not have been interested at the time. And so in Bolivia in the 1950s is where you see the first real cartel sort of develop. It's sort of a proto cartel uh, led by a woman, Blanca de Ibañez. And what they would do is they would produce this cocaine in relatively small quantities and then transport it to Arica in Chile, from where it would be transported by boat to the major port cities in the United States. That's at that point, New York and Los Angeles, which is, by the way, why cocaine became this Hollywood and Wall Street executive drug, right? It's the major port cities. And at that point, most of this stuff was still transported by boat in relatively small quantities. But that's how cocaine manufacturing came to Bolivia. It's because of the attempt to eradicate it from Peru. So they kind of smeared that. And later, of course, when you put all this pressure on Bolivia to do something, crack down on the manufacturing of cocaine, they just moved production to Colombia, where it exploded and became a much bigger problem.
Right, kind of the balloon effect 101.
Yep.
So you've written extensively on this, but one of the questions is, particularly in the Andean region, you see this a lot on in Colombia, right? Is why can we talk about alternative crops, or crop substitution, alternative development? Why can't you grow bananas or oranges in the highlands of Bolivia? You've seen these different attempts. Can you talk a little bit about kind of the resilience of coca as well as the markets, and why perhaps crop substitution has not worked effectively in the Andean highlands?
Sure. Crop substitution is one of those ideas that if you're sitting in a comfy office somewhere in Washington, D.C., and you're thinking about, well, what can we do to convince farmers to stop growing coca? You go, like, well, let them grow bananas. Let them grow something, a coffee. Coffee is very popular. USAID now defunct, of course, used to really like to push coffee beans on farmers. Um, have you been to the Andes, John? You have, right? Okay, so you know what they look like. They're big and they're tall and they're steep. And here's the thing about coca. So Erythroxylum coca, which is the plant that's the bush. It's a bush. It's a bush that doesn't have a lot of parasites. All you have to do effectively is plant a seed in the soil. This bush will grow. Um, it's resilient. It doesn't need a lot of watering. It doesn't need pesticides, and it doesn't need fertilizer. It doesn't need any of these things. Excuse me. It doesn't need any of these things. Plus, you can plant it on these slopes because the Andes is slopes, very, very, very steep slopes. Uh, so it grows very easily. An idiot can grow it. It doesn't take a lot of expertise, which is perfect because the major increase in coca production in Bolivia came in the 70s and 80s as the tin mines were being shut down, as they shut down. And so you have all these mining communities that suddenly have nothing to do. And they figure out, like, well, I suppose we can go back to our farming roots. And what they did is they used this beautiful road that USAID had constructed straight through the province of Cochabamba, or the department of Cochabamba, into an area called the Chapare, which was fairly dense forest, um, with a lot of available land. And so a lot of these miners settled there and figured out, what can we grow? But these are miners, so they're not farmers. And as it turns out, and what these people grow is mostly subsistence crops. So you'll find bananas there, they're there. And you'll find some citrus and some other fruit and potatoes, obviously, and that kind of stuff. And then they grow a bunch of coca to produce a little bit of income, and that's to pay for school uniforms, that kind of stuff. It's not like they're making a lot of money here. Like there's this small scale production, right? And so the coca is there to generate just a little bit of extra income. Growing coffee, like coffee requires a lot of inputs. Coffee requires pesticides and fertilizer and all this kind of stuff. It also requires real expertise, right? Because you have to harvest the coffee beans when they're just at the right time, when they're ripe, and then you have to lay them out and you have to let them dry. And you do this out in the sun. Now, if you do that on the side of a giant mountain in the middle of the Andes, those stupid things will just roll downhill, right? So you need to find a nice flat area to do this, which is scarce in say right here. They just don't have a ton of that. But so you have to dry them, and they have to dry just right, because if they don't dry just right, then your crop is ruined and you can't sell it. So it requires a lot of input, and it requires expertise. It requires that you be selling coffee requires good farming practices. Coca doesn't. Coca is beautiful. You don't, in the sense that it grows by itself. You don't have to do anything to it. It's fine with the rain that it gets. It'll grow in different climates. You can grow it pretty high up on the mountains. You can grow it down on the mountains. You can grow it on the side of a hill. It just doesn't care. It doesn't have a lot of requirements. No pesticides, no fertilizer, none of that. And the harvest is just leaves. Coca is just leaves. It's not berries, it's not fruit, it's just leaves. And you can harvest those 4 times a year, because the thing about leaves on a bush is that they grow back. You pick them, they grow back, just like that. Easy peasy. So you have 4 harvests a year. And in addition, a lot of that stuff is consumed locally, obviously, by people who chew that stuff. Nobody cares if the leaves are slightly bruised or any, like, the requirements there, the quality requirements aren't super stringent either. Whereas with bananas, if you throw those in the back of a pickup truck and you run them down these crappy roads through the Andes Mountains, they're going to end up all bruised. forget it with citrus because there's no way that you can transport that through the Andes on Bolivian roads and end up with a product that you can sell. Like that's just not a thing. Or pineapples or any of these things. I mean, you get this fruit. It's there locally, but Bolivia's landlocked. It doesn't have great roads. It doesn't have great infrastructure, and and if you're chewing coca leaves, they're just leaves. So it doesn't have. You can transport them any which way. It doesn't matter. And if you're using them to produce cocaine, then all that stuff matters even less, right? So it's an incredibly attractive crop that easily generates income. That's pretty stable in terms of the price that you'll get for it. Unlike coffee, where the prices just, I mean, they just go up and down. It's very unpredictable. Coca is a super predictable crop. It is, if you are a beginning farmer or just a dirt farmer who doesn't have a lot of terrain and doesn't have a lot of money for inputs and just needs to generate a bit of income, this is kind of the perfect crop. And only somebody who doesn't understand the Andes and doesn't understand farming and who's sitting in a comfy office somewhere in Washington, D.C., or in Geneva, or in London, or wherever, only somebody like that would come up with an idea that says, let's convince them to grow something much more complicated and much more volatile as a strategy to combat the production of coca. It's too attractive a crop.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. So, piggybacking that, can you kind of discuss the rise of Evo Morales, right? Who was the head of the cocaleros. He also had this famous saying that you've written about extensively, right? Right, coca no es cocaína, coca is not cocaine. Can you discuss the rise of Evo?
I can. He didn't come up with that phrase. That was God, what's his name? Goni, Gonzalo Sanchez de Lozada. He came up with that phrase. That was him. He said, and that was in the 1990s when he was president, and the United States was putting a lot of pressure on Bolivia to combat the production of coca and cocaine, because to the Americans it's the same stuff. To Bolivians, very notably, it is not. And Gonzalo Sanchez de Lozada said exactly that. He said, well, coca isn't cocaine. These are not the same thing, and you can't treat them as the same thing. Coca is going to remain a legal thing in Bolivia. It's going to be in the Bolivian landscape uh, for however long. It's not disappearing anytime soon, let's put it that way. And any tourist who lands at La Paz and gets at their hotel somewhere in La Paz, the first thing they're going to get is a nice cup of coca tea because it'll help you with your headache from the lack of oxygen. And it's going to stay that way. Um, Evo's rise to power. Um, Evo was a coca farmer, cocalero, a coca farmer in the Chapare region, right? Precisely that area of Cochabamba that had been opened up so helpfully by USAID in the late 1960s. It's one of their brilliant projects. He was one of those farmers, and he became quite active in the syndicalist movement. And one of the things to sort of go back to when I said that what you had there was a lot of people who had been miners in the 1980s and had moved to the Chapare when the mines shut down, they brought all their political activism with them. Right, so these miners, the Bolivian miners, were very well known for their unions and their syndicates, and sort of their organized labor. They were very well known for that, still are. Bolivians do a lot of organized labor. They took that with them. So all of those structures, the syndicates and the labor unions, they just went with to the Chapare. And so among these coca farmers in the Chapare, you have a very strong labor movement. And it became this whole confederation of little syndicates and little labor movements, and they have this umbrella organization. And Evo rose up through the ranks, as the head of that umbrella organization that represents the cocaleros of the Chapale. So he did that. Then in the Now, Gonzalo Sanchez de Lozada, who was president of Bolivia for much of the 90s, paid lip service to American efforts to get Bolivia to crack down on coca. He would say, sure, yes, we'll do this and that. He was never particularly enthusiastic about it for two reasons. His economics were pretty sound, and he understood that there is no economic incentive for Bolivians to shut down one of their major industries. It's just one of their major exports. It's economic suicide. And secondly, he knew really well, he understood that in Bolivia, in Bolivian society, the use of coca is ingrained. It's completely normal. And it's completely normal for people to chew coca. It's an indigenous thing, but even respectable families in the cities will have their coca tea. Like it's just everywhere. It's it's everywhere. It's a part of the Bolivian sort of landscape, and it's a part of Bolivian identity. It's embedded in that. And Gonzalo Sanchez de Lozada understood that if he started to really crack down on farmers, poor farmers, producing a little bit of coca, which is an acceptable, socially acceptable practice and a socially acceptable thing to have and to produce, if you start cracking down on them, that this would play very badly among ordinary Bolivians. It's not just economically unhealthy. This politically is not going to be doing you any favors. He understood that, so he didn't go that far, and he didn't fight that hard. And they did a couple of things about cocaine itself, but they did not really go after the farmers, because again, those are not rich people, and they are organized, and they are sympathetic to the Bolivian audience, right? Because they were displaced by mine closures. They're engaging in a socially acceptable practice. They're growing a socially acceptable product. They are, in the minds of Bolivians, not doing anything wrong. And in addition, they're very well organized and very sympathetic, and they are poor. And if anybody counts as the downtrodden, I guess it's them, right? So he understood that. Then in the very late, at the end of the century, you get Hugo Banzer Suarez. He becomes president. This is on the heels of Gonzalo Sanchez de Lozada, who was very involved in sort of neoliberal reforms in Bolivia, which, in my opinion, were very necessary, but also were incredibly painful to Bolivians. And Hugo Banzer Suarez had been a military dictator in the 1970s. And so people remembered him for what they considered sort of the economic good old days. And so they gave him another shot. But Hugo Banzer Suarez was very happy to jump on board the anti-cocaine bandwagon with the United States, because this came with a lot of U.S. Assistance. And that's assistance lent by USAID, but also DEA, boots on the ground, to advise and assist and do all these things, to help train the sort of the new anti-coca military force that they created. And he did this under the banner of Coca Zero, meaning zero coca. That did not, by the way, mean no coca at all. It meant what they describe as zero coca excedentaria, meaning no coca in excess of what is consumed by the Bolivian population in the traditional way. And so what they did is they said you can only grow coca legally in the Yungas provinces, North and South Yungas. By the way, just absolutely stunningly beautiful area. Um, and so that made effectively the whole Chapare an area of illegal coca production. And then they pursued their campaign by going in and burning down a whole bunch of coca fields, ripping out plants and all that. And this, of course, led to big protests and confrontation with the labor unions representing the cocaleros, with Evo Morales at the head as the public face of the movement. And it just propelled him into the public consciousness in a way that nobody else possibly could have. Um, then at the tail end of that, because of the reforms in the 1990s that Gonzalo Sanchez Lozada was responsible for, the previously useless state oil company had been partially privatized, and so it received injections of foreign investment that started to go look for gas again, which they hadn't done in a while, discovered large deposits of natural gas. And that became an issue between 2003 and 2005 as Bolivians needed to start figuring out what to do with all this gas that they discovered. And so those protests, those movements happened at around the same time. So it was Tuto Quiroga who came up with this plan. I don't know if you know this, but at the time, the state of California was suffering from shortages of natural gas. They were in an energy crisis. And so the idea was, let's take this Bolivian gas, let's build a pipeline to the Chilean coast, let's build a big liquefaction factory there and produce liquefy this gas, ship it to California, and sell it at a nice profit. Economically very sound, but what it looked like to the average Bolivian was a bunch of foreigners are yet again going to steal our natural resources and get rich off of it. So it sparked huge protests, so-called gas wars of 2003-ish, the gas wars, in which you have people running around with giant banners, big protest movement, giant banners saying "El gas es nuestro, no se vende," meaning the gas is ours, it's not for sale, which is not how natural gas and hydrocarbons in general work, because if you don't sell them, then they just sit there and they don't do anything for you. But in any case, Evo Morales, again, he gets himself at the forefront of sort of that. He manages to marry these two questions. Like on the one hand, it's the gas, which is now going to benefit the Americans. And on the other hand, it's Americans insisting on Bolivia shooting its own people because Americans don't know how not to shove cocaine up their nose, right? And so he goes, well, that is an American problem, not a Bolivian one. We're just coca farmers. This is a socially acceptable thing. But in the meantime, we're getting shot at the behest of American imperialists who are now also trying to steal our gas. That is how he gets propelled really just into the public imagination. He becomes insanely popular as a result. And it's because just this image of troops going into the Chapare, burning down poor people's fields, protesters getting shot at by troops trained by Americans because America demands that Bolivia crack down on dirt farmers. That whole thing just did not go over well in Bolivia. He becomes the face sort of this unified anti-gas. So let's nationalize hydrocarbons again. and let's kick the Americans out and leave coca farmers alone. That's him. And
What
he
were his
becomes
relations like with the DEA and the Chapada? Didn't he kick them out? What were the relations like during his presidency with the U.S. government and kind of the,
well,
counter narcotics policies?
he gets elected in 2005, comes into office 2006, and he gets elected on a platform. And his platform was very simple. It's A, uh, nationalize hydrocarbons, and B, kick the Americans out. And this is what he does. He does like he's. Let's put it this way: he's a man of his word. Um, he nationalizes hydrocarbons. Um, and negotiates much better prices at the wellhead and variety of like the deals that the Bolivians had created for their natural gas were in reality not fantastic. So he improves on that, even though they did torpedo this plan to export gas to California, which would have made them the most money. Um, but I mean, it's this resource nationalism that's pretty common to the whole region, but um, I would, in the Bolivian case, I would describe it as economic xenophobia, quite frankly. Um, and he kicks out the DEA and those parts of USAID that are there to try and convince farmers to switch crops and do all that. So USAID doesn't get completely removed, but the parts that were working with the DEA, the parts that were working on behalf of drug eradication, those parts get removed. So yeah, the DEA is out almost immediately, um, and that's kind of and that's kind of how it goes. And then what he does is he creates this. Uh, he also oversees a new national convention to create a new constitution that creates the plurinational Republic of Bolivia, and sort of recognizes indigenous rights and does a bunch of that stuff. It's a very progressive document in a lot of ways, but a lot of Latin American constitutions are very progressive documents, which is easy if you don't enforce them, which they generally don't do. So I mean, he does that, and after that, I mean, at this point, a lot of the production of cocaine has already moved to Colombia, and Colombia has become by the 1990s, by the 1980s, Colombia has become the major producer of coca and cocaine. And Bolivia is one of three players, but it is the third biggest. It's after Colombia and then Peru and then Bolivia. So Bolivia is not a very big player in this. And most Bolivian cocaine is for the regional market. It goes to Brazil and Argentina and places like that. Relatively fairly little Bolivian cocaine ends up in the American or even European marketplace. Right, so we're not talking about huge production, and there are efforts there to bring it under control. And one of the things that he does is because he has to talk about coca as this sacred leaf, which he does all the time, and then he tries to invent new industries, new things to do. So you get coca toothpaste, and you get coca drinks, and all kinds of and coca soaps and coca museums and new uses. But I mean, that's none of that is a huge success. Um, what he does do is he creates agreements that of how much coca these little farmers can produce, and so it's a limited amount. Um, and like I said, Bolivia is a third largest producer, but it's not enormous. And so under Evo Morales, effectively what they do is they leave the coca producers alone, and they also leave the criminal networks, which you of course need to distribute the stuff. They also leave those largely alone. So you've got uh, the two major Brazilian sort of prison-based gangs, the Red Command and the other one, what are they called?
PCC,
Commander.
Primera
Yeah, yeah,
Comando de
exactly.
Command.
You've got them both operating in Bolivia, but not engaging in a lot of violence. And so Bolivia, for the most part, is quiet. I mean, you have coca production. You can see it, and then behind that there is a part where that, of course, gets produced into or transmogrified into cocaine, and that then gets shipped out because Bolivia itself does not have a particularly big market for it. But I mean, that's an underground thing. It's not in your face. It requires a lot of corruption. What it really mirrors is kind of what drug smuggling looked like in Mexico while the PRI was still in charge. Like so that's look that's my best comparison really. It leads to a bunch of political corruption, but not to a bunch of violence,
Right.
if that
For the
makes sense.
audience, so the Institutional Revolutionary Party, the PRI and the Spanish acronym, were basically in charge for 71 years and cut deals with drug traffickers, right, until 2000. So you've written a lot on state fragility in Bolivia and in Latin America in general. Can you kind of first explain this for the audience? And then what is the relationship, let's say, between state fragility, corruption, and impunity in organized
That's a
crime?
lot of questions all at once. Let's see. Bolivian state fragility. Bolivia has been called the ungovernable state. And so what that means is this. Um, in Bolivia, you have an elite that is largely, but not exclusively, descended from from conquistadors, from Europeans, from Spaniards. It's a small elite, and again, not exclusive. There's a whole bunch of indigeneity in there as well. That's baked in, and you've got at this point plenty of wealthy indigenous individuals as well. It's just an interesting place. You have a very large indigenous population. We can argue endlessly about what percentage it is, and the argument stems from the fact that in the Bolivian context, indigeneity is something that you have to perform, and if you and so your ethnic identity is something that you can change throughout your lifetime, which to an American or European is a weird idea. But there it's kind of built in, and you express what you are by how you dress, right? So there is a particular style of dress for people who are mixed, let's say. They don't need to be mixed, but you know, and you and in Bolivia you call them cholos, which is in Central America something quite different. I'm aware, but that's the category there, which originally meant it's a 1/4 mixture. Um, but okay, so you've got that. That's kind of what takes the place of the mestizo in Mexico. And then you've got indigenous people, and we're still, and most of the cholos and the indigenous people are of pure indigenous extraction, right? So these ethnic categories are just a little bit strange. But what you have is a very large indigenous population. Uh, in reality, probably still 80%, 85%. In the statistics, they'll show up as 60-ish%. And these are Quechua and Aymara speaking indigenous peoples, which which are largely in rural areas, and the urban periphery is where you'll also find them. And the closer you get to the city center, the more this becomes a cholo society, cholita, and then you have a sort of a self-identified white core, which again those words don't mean quite the same thing. But so you've got this ethnic division, and this ethnic division is a historical division. It's one that the Spanish imposed. They came up with the dress styles and all that, like the polleras all those skirts that these cholitas wear, like that was imposed. You have got the bowler hats in La Paz. You might recognize that. And what the Spanish did is they created this system where the style of hat you wear indicates which particular region you're from, so that they would know where you owe your taxes. Like that's where it comes from. That's where the styles come from. But in any case, um, those ethnic differences are pretty stark. And while there is a tendency in the West to talk about Bolivian and Peruvian indigenous peoples as sort of purely downtrodden, in the Bolivian case, this is not quite true. These are people who, because of the strength in numbers and because they are an important source of, or historically have been an important source of state revenue, they have considerable power, political power that you express, as they've been doing in recent weeks, by throwing up blockades, by making traffic within the country impossible, by starving cities, by outright rebellion, which certainly has happened plenty in the 20th century. So it's this really important block, and you cannot govern Bolivia without the tacit consent of that bloc. Then you've got sort of the labor bloc, and the labor it's traditionally for Bolivia largely mining, and that's still an important industry. Now it's mining and hydrocarbons. But again, there's this very strong history of organized labor, of very strong labor unions. They still have those. And when they get upset, they can also throw up blockades and they will stop work. And then nobody produces anything and you can't go anywhere. And so they can paralyze, both of those groups can paralyze the country completely at the drop of a hat. And they do this frequently. That's a power that they exercise all the time. And so if you're in power, you have to at least get them to go along, because when they decide that they're really against something you're doing, they can paralyze the entire country. This has happened a number of times. It's how Evo Morales got into power. Like two two presidents were removed by Morales and by these whole protest movements. They had to. Carlos Mesa said this country is ungovernable, which at the time it was, and Gonzalo Sanchez de Lozada had to effectively
Leave,
flee
right?
the country in fear of his life. Bolivians are not above hanging presidents right there at the Plaza Murillo in front of the presidential palace. The first president ever to emerge from Gonzalo Sanchez de Lozada's party was Gualberto Villarroel, and he was hanged in 1946 right there in the square, right there. And this was what was going to happen to him if he stayed. So there is this popular power, and one of the problems there is that you have these different groups of people. You've got indigenous, largely farming communities, many of whom live in these communities that are quite old, quite traditional, quite conservative, have very strong social control. And when people from those communities move to the urban periphery, they often bring those structures with them. So Bolivia is a country with a lot of where there is pretty strict social control, which means it's safe. Like there's not a lot of violence. People don't feel safe, but they are. There's not a lot of violence. It's just, but there is very strong social organization, labor organization, and then you have on top of that a state, the Bolivian state, which is incredibly weak, largely because it lacks sources of revenue. It's a poor state that has all of these institutions that they built when they became independent. And they decided, like, what kind of state are we going to be? And then you need to build all these institutions that a modern state is supposed to have. They just did it with a completely destroyed infrastructure as a result of wars of independence, and so without revenues. And so Bolivian institutions have consistently been underfunded, and they continue to be very, very underfunded. And underfunding leads to widespread corruption, um, which is bad for society, but it's there. Widespread corruption, um, and institutions that don't function particularly well. And you can see this in the Bolivian justice system, which is not very good at delivering justice. You can see it in all of none of these institutions work particularly well. So it's weak and it's tenuous, and it exists in a society that has social structures that are much stronger than it. And so for the state to function under those circumstances is exceedingly difficult. Also because let's say the interests of the labor unions and the interests of indigenous movements, they don't necessarily coincide. They tend to speak like they're on the same side because they're both oppressed and downtrodden, poor, and all that. But the interests of the hydrocarbon industry, let's say, is absolutely not aligned with those of indigenous communities trying to safeguard, preserves and areas and natural areas, etc. And so you have that, and then you have a military that is also not particularly strong. What the Bolivian military excels at historically more so than any other in Latin America is losing wars, because they've never won a single one. They've lost every one they've had, except the Second World War, which they just joined several days before the end. So I guess that one counts. But Bolivia is paradoxical in the sense that it's quite safe for individuals, and again, they don't feel safe, but they, compared to neighboring countries, they really are. So it's quite safe. It's quite corrupt. I mean, government institutions are quite corrupt. Um, Stunningly beautiful, but very difficult to govern.
So, in the last couple of questions, and one of these, I know you feel strongly about this question. Daniel Goldstein, Desmond Arias kind of have this terrific book on violent democracies, and they talk about the institutions. And so, one of the questions that I think you're aligned with kind of their argument, but that you see is, well, why not just reform the institutions, or why not pass a new law, or is it, and so is there this notion that some of the corruption and kind of violence and these challenges are built into the institutions, or is it just you have to reform multiple institutions, this kind of whole of government approach? How do you fall in this kind of debate and argument among practitioners as well as scholars?
Um, well, Bolivian institutions are particularly weak. And so if your question is, can you just reform that away? Well, that's Darren Asamolu has things to say about that. It's difficult. Now, in the Bolivian case, we've seen specific examples that suggest that you can. La Paz had a mayor whose name escapes me because it's been a while. La Paz had a mayor for a good long time who was on the warpath to eliminate corruption from the city. And he made real progress. He really, really did. Undeniable. For Bolivia as a whole, for these state institutions, is it built in? I mean, yes, it is. It is built in. It's how to say this. I mean, the sources of revenue are not there, and Bolivia is this beautiful example of this paradox that you see. This paradox that you see in across Latin America, and just perhaps slightly more in a slightly more exaggerated form in Bolivia. Bolivians balance these two incompatible ideas. So on the one hand, Bolivians have no faith in their institutions. They do not have faith in their institutions. They do not have faith in the judiciary. They do not have faith in the political system. They don't have faith in political parties. You can look at the LAPOP surveys. it's pretty clear they don't have faith in these institutions. But on an abstract level, they hold this belief that the Bolivian state, as an abstract entity, is capable of solving all of these societal and economic problems that Bolivia suffers. And the most important of those is Bolivia is poor. Let's take that as the big thing. So Bolivians have this fundamental idea, like a lot of Latin Americans do, that the Bolivian state is capable of changing society, of organizing society, of solving problems, right? And so if you have this belief, while you at the same time don't trust the institutions and don't trust the politicians and don't trust the parties, then the question is always, why isn't the Bolivian state solving this fundamental problem? And it's this, and what it comes down to is what I would describe as Galeano's curse. Eduardo Galeano wrote this book, The Open Veins of Latin America, and it's this sort of dependency theory kind of take on why is Latin America poor? And then the answer is because foreigners keep stealing all of our stuff. Problem with that whole thing is it's not untrue. Historically, the Spaniards showed up, stole a whole bunch of gold and silver. Later on, the British show up and they take a whole bunch of stuff. And so I understand that there are historical roots to this. But so Bolivians and Peruvians and a bunch of the other Bolivians look around them in Bolivian society, and what they see is we have all this mineral wealth, and we've got all this natural wealth, and we've got oil and gas. We've got all this natural wealth, all these natural resources. Why is it that in spite of all these natural resources, we are poor? And then the answer is obviously because foreigners keep stealing it all. And so then the question becomes, well, how do you solve that problem? And you solve that problem by kicking foreigners out, by nationalizing industries. And then you look at the state and you go like, well, why isn't the state solving this problem? And then you have two answers that people will give you. It's because they are serving foreign interests and because they are corrupt. And so you can get elected in Bolivia on this platform. I know why we are poor. It is because foreigners are stealing all our stuff. I am going to nationalize those resources, give them back to the Bolivian people, and then people will vote for that. And the problem is that never solves the problem because Bolivia is poor because it doesn't have an industrial base. There's no industry. They don't produce anything. They just have natural resources. And that's not how you get rich. And so that doesn't solve the problem. And so then 5 years on, people will look and go, well, why are we still poor then? And then the answer is very simple. Our leaders are corrupt and working on behalf of foreigners. And so you get this constant, and when you decide that the problem is that your leaders are corrupt and that they're working for foreign interests, then the solution is very simple. You have to take those people and kick them out. And so Bolivia goes through these cyclical revolutions and sort of this political upheaval that just repeats and repeats and repeats because people regard the fundamental issue as a simple one, and then they come up with simple solutions that don't work because that's not what the source of the problem is. Right? But it's constant. It's this constant cycle of moving from pro-nationalization to pro-privatization, because the problem is for a country like Bolivia with weak institutions, the problem is that when you nationalize the mining industry, let's say, you're putting it in the hands of a government that we know to be very inefficient, very weak, and highly corrupt. And so then you're creating a state-owned enterprise that's going to suffer from those same problems, and that will slowly deteriorate sort of the economic strength of that industry, like it did with mining, because they nationalized that and ran it into the ground, like they did with hydrocarbons several times in a row. They managed to run that completely into the ground by the early 1990s. We had a state-owned oil company that just wasn't doing any of the things that a state-owned oil company is supposed to do. Their wells were drying up. They weren't discovering new ones. They weren't looking. There was no exploration, and it was run by people who got those positions because they were owed political favors, not because they knew anything about oil and gas. And so you get this cycle. Because at a certain point, people see, well, our state-owned enterprises are insanely corrupt. Maybe we should privatize them. And so then you privatize them, and that privatization is painful, and it leads to and that's an adjustment, and it leads to increased unemployment, etc. And so if that doesn't solve your whole problem in 5 years, people look at it and go like, well, that didn't work. Why didn't that work? Because our leaders are corrupt and foreigners are, and they just sold our national resources to the highest bidder. So they're vende patrias, they sold out their country. And so let's undo the whole thing. Let's start all over. Let's renationalize that. And it's just on this cycle. Bolivia has nationalized its hydrocarbons 5 times in the last 100 years, right? And so it doesn't solve the problem because there's a fundamental misunderstanding of where the issue is. Is the corruption built into the institutions? So long as you chronically underfund those institutions, yes, there's no escaping it. And so you have two choices then. You can go two ways. One is figure out a way to make more money. And you would do that through industrialization, but Bolivia is an unattractive place for foreign investment because they're so married to the idea that any kind of successful foreign enterprise is evidence that their resources are being stolen and therefore must be punished by nationalization of those resources. So it's difficult to find people who want to invest in Bolivian resources like lithium, which it has tons of, because it's just not a safe environment to invest in. Or you can scale back what the institutions are supposed to be doing. Like that's your other option, because what Bolivia can't do at its current levels of economic activity is have all of these institutions do all of the things that they want them to do, because they simply have the money to do it, right? And so then you get a lack of enforcement, and what you get then is this phenomenon where you get people who come from the Netherlands or the United States and who sit in their office and think about some problem that Bolivia has, and then they come to Bolivia and they lobby for some law or whatever. And I've talked to those people who show up and say, look, well, I'm here to lobby for this environmental law. And you think, well, listen, if you look at Bolivian legislation, it's quite progressive. It's a very progressive constitution. Bolivia since 1939 has had some of the most progressive housing laws and labor laws known to man. It doesn't mean very much if you don't enforce any of it, and if you don't have the means to enforce it, because that's the problem. You can have all the laws on what a house is required to have, but if you can't afford anybody to do inspections, and if you do have one or two inspectors for the entire department of La Paz, which isn't enough, any place they come is just, and you underpay them, well, then it breeds this opportunity for bribery, and that's unfortunately how that works.
Yeah, no, that's fascinating. So one last question. You've written a lot on the prison system, on drug policy, and on mano dura, or iron fist kind of hardline strategies. What are some of the trends that you see in this kind of mano dura approach within Bolivia, despite, as you mentioned, not having the same levels of violence as maybe other countries of Mexico or its neighbor Brazil? There does seem to be, in terms of a lot of the polling opinion, if you've written extensively on, a lot of support for these hardline strategies. What do you see as that relation as well as trends going forward?
So mano dura for Bolivia is tricky. Tricky. So the level it doesn't suffer from high levels of violence. Not like other parts of Latin America. It's fairly it's a safe society. I mean, it's not it's I feel as safe in Bolivia as I do here, quite frankly. Um, and so mano dura is tricky in Bolivia because um, one of the most corrupt institutions that you have is the police. And so there's just not a lot of appetite among Bolivians to have more police or to give police more power than they already have. Like that appetite is not really there. Um, in Bolivia, what mano dura looks like is sort of sort of throw away the key. Like so, if you have people who are suspected of having done something, then just throw them in jail and never let them out, effectively. But because Bolivians have no faith in the judicial system, and I can't really say that I blame them, um, what mano dura translates into in Bolivian reality on the ground, and especially in sort of the urban periphery, and I suspect in rural areas we just don't know, um, is fairly widespread lynching practices. So mano dura in Bolivia is where somebody gets caught stealing a can of Coke or gets accused of being a delinquent, and then the punishment quite frequently becomes um, being beaten to within an inch of your life in public with a lot of people watching, and then doused in gasoline and set on fire, or occasionally buried alive. That also happens. But the profound lack of faith in police, who can also be targeted, by the way, for that treatment. The profound lack of faith in police makes it that nobody in Bolivia would run on a political platform that said, let's have a lot more police. Like that wouldn't get you very far. It's just not an environment that lends itself to that, because police are one of the primary ways in which Bolivians become victims of crime. Not so much. Uh, it's not really regarded as a preventative force, and so I haven't. I mean, Bolivia is just not a place where you see a lot of calls for. I mean, zero tolerance just means harsh sentencing, but it doesn't mean let's have a lot more police or let's give police broader powers. It really
So it's not
doesn't.
like to see the Bukele model or this
Nope.
giant militarization.
No, but Bolivia also really doesn't have the same kind of gang problem, right? So it's not. It's and in Bolivians will in Bolivia it that used to be in the 1990s, if somebody got mugged, uh, people would quickly say like, "Oh, it was Peruvians. Peruvians did it." In 2026, they're going to say, "Oh, it was Brazilians or Venezuelans. Like that's who did it." Um, so they're pretty good at uh, blaming other people, but uh, it just doesn't have that kind of gang activity, and you wouldn't be able to crack down in the same way. And in addition, Bolivia's really chosen more for that uh, pre-2000s Mexican model, where if we leave you alone and then you leave us alone, um, so yeah, it's no, it's I don't see a Bukele like approach really succeeding in Bolivia. But I mean, to be perfectly honest, Bolivians never ever suffered the kind of widespread um, pandemic of citizen insecurity that El Salvador did. Right? That's I think if they had those kinds of levels of insecurity, I think the situation would be very, very different. But Bolivia is one of the safest countries in all of Latin America, and so not ripe for that kind of activity. And again, the really strong sort of social organization that you have, even in the urban periphery, where you get these communities that are just transplanted from rural areas, like the levels of social control really are quite strong, and and those communities just don't have a lot of there's not a lot of tolerance for delinquents, especially ones who don't belong. That's they don't tolerate that particularly well. It's really not a lot of Latin America. If you take a country like El Salvador, El Salvador had an indigenous community, but that's like really devolved. I mean, that there's not much left of that, and there's not much left of those structures, and so you have society itself is much weaker than in Bolivia has very strong social institutions, and just which you don't find quite as much in other parts of Latin America, except to some extent probably in Guatemala, parts of Mexico, Chiapas, for example. And but you see it, the Chiapas is also just not an area that lends itself to the kind of criminality that you'll find in let's say Tamaulipas. Chiapas doesn't lend itself to that because those are communities that will fight back.
Except it's bordering Guatemala, so you'll see a lot of things crossing through, right? I mean,
Yep.
that's geography is a challenge.
No, it is, but they don't engage in widespread violence in Chiapas itself because it would be a mistake to do that. And Bolivia is really much more like that.
Yeah. Well, this has been really, really fascinating. I highly recommend Dr. Breenen's work. He's a terrific, terrific writer. As I promised, he's many things, but never boring. So it's really a pleasure. I will leave it at that. Is there anything else I missed, Dr. Breeden?
Uh, Goodness, well, there's so incredibly much that we can talk about. Bolivia
Sure,
is
sure, sure.
it's a fascinating place, really is. And again, it's stunning. It's stunningly beautiful, and I can't recommend it enough as a location to visit. It's stunningly beautiful, and it is quite safe. It's a fascinating society, and it's one of these places where indigenous people like they're in a yes they're economically um of course at the bottom, but I mean quite strong. It's like they're there and they're holding their own. They really are, and they are attached to their own institutions and lifeways and pathways. And I don't mean to romanticize that in a sort of a sense like, oh, they've maintained the exact same institutions that they had like from before the Inca. Of course not. You can't have 500 years of colonization and living together in the same space with other people without it affecting both sides. Western urban culture in Bolivia is different from other places, but um, it's. I mean, but these communities are not weak. They're not that. They're not. I mean, they have been victimized, but they're perfectly good at dishing it out as well, which is, I mean, it's just a fascinating place.
Yeah, well, absolutely. Thank you so much. We really appreciate your time, and hopefully we can chat in the future.
You're welcome.
Thank, thank you.